All right, looks like we're live. So, welcome everybody who's tuning in this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located. Uh, so, today I have Charlie here with me. He is a global security analyst, actually, our most senior global security analyst. And I am David Newman, as it says up there on the screen. I'm also a global security analyst here with Rain. I tend to focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. Charlie has covered Sub-Saharan Africa before, but also is primarily focused in the Middle East. And yet today we are going to be talking about the Islamic State, which is relevant, unfortunately, tragically, to both regions. So if you were here with us before, just a few months ago, we talked about jihadist expansion in sub-Saharan Africa, but we particularly focused on West Africa, and we were looking at different threats there. Today, we're actually going to flip it and look at the region more broadly, but focus specifically on the Islamic State. And as it turns out, good timing here. Charlie actually just published a piece on the trajectory of the Islamic State in sub Saharan Africa. And so, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlie. If you could just tell us about your analysis, what kind of trends you identified, what you think is important moving forward as we sort of assess the Islamic State's presence and also its kind of future trajectory in sub-Saharan Africa. Hey, Charlie, real quick, for some reason, I can't hear what you're saying. I'm worried that our viewers may not be able to hear what you're saying either. Maybe you're on mute. Sorry, everybody. Just give us 1 second. This is one of those.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes, sir. We can hear you. So, Charlie, yeah, if you could just start from the beginning, that would be great.
Apologies. So, technical issues, folks. With Islamic State in Africa, as of right now, the present threat is a series of diverse militant groups that are all linked to Islamic State by a common oath of allegiance. But they don't necessarily, and they pose acute regional threats, but they don't necessarily pose larger um, uh, either across larger broad threats or larger global threats, and that's kind of where we're at right now. Islamic State attacks in the region spiked in 2020, I believe, and we've seen about 3,000 attacks from 2020 to the present. But as I need to really drill down here right now, Islamic State is a problem in far as its affiliates are concerned. There are affiliates across the Sub-Saharan Africa region, but they don't appear to be coordinated that much amongst each other, or there doesn't appear to be a common Islamic State Sub-Saharan Africa, for want of a better term, in terms of a broad regional threat. So we have Islamic State West Africa Province, which is probably one of the largest Islamic State affiliates in the region. We also have the Allied Democratic Forces in Uganda, which um, are part of Islamic State Central Africa Province, or
Which I
and
would
then
say, just real quick, are the ADF, maybe originally in Uganda, but at least right now more
yep,
active and operating in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
yep, yep.
But yeah, continue.
Um, and then also we obviously also have Islamic State Mozambique, which a lot of people in the oil and gas sector have been following for a significant period of time, as well as Islamic State Greater Sahel or Greater Sahara, which is operating more in the Mali, Burkina Faso space. Um, And that's kind of where the situation is right now. What we've seen over the last couple of months that is somewhat of a worrying, somewhat of a concerning trend, I should say, rather, is Islamic State core is really starting to trumpet and really starting to focus more of its propaganda efforts on its sub-Saharan African affiliates. A large extent of that propaganda is for West Africa province, but it does span Africa more broadly. In fact, in earlier this year, there was a call in the Islamic State magazine and Naba, which is the global Islamic State publication, to for fighters to emigrate to Africa to wage jihad against well, in that case, local Nigerian or other forces. But the idea put forth in the article is that Sub-Saharan Africa can be a base for jihad, given how poorly fortunes have gone for Islamic State in Syria and Iraq as of late. And that's kind of the more worrying trend, or more worrying point, is the core is really starting to devote more resources to these affiliates.
Yeah, that's interesting, from what I understand, what you're laying out here is we have these various affiliates. They're operating in often completely different regional contexts or geopolitical contexts. I mean, if you look at what they're operating in Mozambique, what they're facing in Mozambique versus how they're operating as ISGS, for example, in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, is going to be definitely different. And at least from what I think you're saying, there doesn't seem to be some super centralized command and control, or at least coordination between those affiliates. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the situation right now. Is there appears to be financial ties between the various affiliates. They probably all get money from the same financial sources, or at least from from a number of financial networks, which we can talk about later. You actually just wrote an interesting piece on one as well. Um, but there doesn't appear to be a broad command and control coordination synchronizing all of the work of all the various Sub-Saharan Africa affiliates. And so that's kind of where we're at. We're kind of in a fairly early stage where there isn't an Islamic State Sub-Saharan Africa, for want of a better term, or a big, large apparatus, the same way we had a cross-regional or a cross-border apparatus in Iraq and Syria. There isn't that same that same level of like one defined command and control structure.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. I think I would push back a little bit. And yes, totally agree that we are not in the stage where there is an established caliphate, for example, like we saw in Iraq, that spanned borders. But at the same time, I think especially if you look at ISGS and ISWAP, the West Africa province, that's yes operating in Nigeria, but also concentrated in that Lake Chad basin region. So it is still affecting. It's still carrying out attacks in a cross border fashion. And that in part is the biggest concern that we have for West Africa, like we talked about, where, and of course, we don't just have the Islamic State operating there. We also have Al Qaeda and its affiliates that are really probably control even more territory. But even if you just look at ISGS, I mean, one of the things that I've written on recently and have been following is their expansion eastward in Mali. And so, of course, they've been in that tri-border region, in that pocket, for a while now, but it definitely has cross-border implications. It doesn't mean they're establishing a caliphate. I definitely grant you that, but it is sort of on a much more smaller scale, still something that is raising those concerns about what kind of territory can they capture, what kind of territory can they hold. But of course, there's going to be constraints to that, which is actually something I wanted to ask you about next. Is even if we're not seeing this sort of unified, massive umbrella of Islamic State, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which I don't even think would necessarily make sense for the group, given that they're operating in such a broad geographic scope. Um, what kind of I don't know what kind of constraints are there to the Islamic State, and maybe we tackle this by specific province or affiliate, but what kind of constraints are we looking at to that could actually limit each group or each affiliate's growth in their specific contexts?
So in the broad strokes, I would say one of the bigger ones is competition with other jihadists.
Mm,
Or they kind of come in different categories. You have competition with other jihadists. That's especially true in the both the West Africa, but also the Sahel context, where you have JNIM and other Al Qaeda affiliates still being much more established, having a longer track record, having more resources, and just generally being more capable than their Islamic State counterparts. Even though ISGS is growing, it still faces a challenge from JNI from Jama al-Nusra Muslimin um, in uh, in uh, in Uganda and to a lesser extent, Uganda slash DRC, and then also in Mozambique, um, you've got territorial constraints insofar as there's a fairly large multinational security force in Mozambique that's trying to control the growth of Islamic State. Um,
and I think
and,
they have. I mean, yes, especially when you look at sort of
yeah,
the mapped attack data, you can see where the group has expanded its scope of attacks in Mozambique, but at the same time, uh, they did lose a lot of territorial control, especially compared to what they were able to accomplish in the first years of their insurgency. And I think that brings up a good point. Is it sort of brings up how we talk about growth, and uh,
mhm,
obviously, I think it's unrealistic to project that uh, the Islamic State establishes some caliphate in Nigeria, for example, and overthrows the government, because I think the biggest constraint there, of course, is
mhm,
the Nigerian military.
yeah,
They're launching this slew of offensives in the Northeast where the group is based. It does have ripple effects in that it can drive uh, Islamic State cells, fighters to spread further across the country, which is what we're seeing, and even in the recent, terrorist attack threat warning that was issued by the U.S. Embassy. They do pose a threat to Abuja now because they've expanded.
yeah.
Uh, does that necessarily mean they're strengthening? Does it mean they're consolidating? Does it mean they're holding territory? Not necessarily, but that also doesn't mean that the threat has been lowered because of that. In fact, as we're seeing in Nigeria, that can
Yeah.
also elevate the threat to the capital areas where that are more populous, that have more of a tourist or foreigner or foreign business location. So I just think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. But I do think going forward, especially given where we're at right now, the worrying things that we're going to look at, given the tenor of Islamic State core and how they're approaching Sub-Saharan Africa, I still think that a key indicators going forward will be the development of those either centralized command and control networks or regionalized command and control networks where maybe you have we already have the ADF using the Central Africa province
Mm-hmm.
motto, for example, and then you have the um, maybe down the road. I'm not saying this is likely, but down the road we could see a merger of GS and ISWAP. I mean, not GS and ISWAP, but as an example, but see mergers of various networks to make their resources, to uh, pool their resources better and pull strategy more and just make for a larger threat.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's definitely true, and I think that speaks to why uh,
Mhm,
geographic expansion can be so concerning. One, because it causes spillover; it creates a problem for neighboring countries that may have not had to deal with this kind of threat prior. This is a huge reason why we're we're so focused on tracking these developments in West Africa. And I mean, as you point out, even if it's not likely now, uh, if you look at the map, it very well could turn into a situation where ISGS is able to sort of create this corridor from that tri-border region in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso into Benin, into that northwestern part of Nigeria. Of course, it would require a lot of success for both
Yep,
ISGS
yep,
and ISWAP to be able to meet in the middle there. But I mean, that's one of those high impact scenarios that we would definitely be looking for.
yep.
The last question before we sort of close this out, Charlie, is um, you were talking about indicators that would sort of elevate this threat um, or create a more alarming trajectory for the Islamic State. And I think one of the questions that often gets circulated around is at what point would it be, or could it be, that one of these IS affiliates uh, reaches the point to where they can stage a larger external attack, and by external, not just
Yep.
outside of the country that they're currently waging an insurgency, but somewhere broader, more far-reaching, the whole far enemy
Yep.
concept. Uh, Even if that's still at a low likelihood, what would be the indicators that we would be sort of looking for that would start to ring the early alarm bells in that scenario?
So a couple things I would look for is one of the big ones is foreign fighter flows. Like I say, we've had this call for foreigners to emigrate to Africa, but we haven't seen the large scale flows of foreign fighters to
Mm,
the various affiliates in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're not seeing an Afghanistanization of the sub-Saharan African jihadist environment, at least yet anyway. And so a large number of foreign fighters going in that provides them an opportunity to, um, to, at a minimum, it provides them an opportunity to to gain battlefield skills. If we're talking about foreign jihadists coming from, perhaps uh, West African communities, let's say, for example, in France or
mm,
other immigrant communities in the West. The other thing is if they flee from Syria and Iraq to sub-Saharan Africa in an effort to escape U.S. pressure,
mm.
that's another that would give the West African groups more capability because they would have that experience and that institutional knowledge that the Syrian jihadists and the Iraqi jihadists built up over the years.
Sure.
I think it's a fairly low likelihood scenario that we'll see that. That being said, I think as Iraq and Syria become less permissive environments, jihadists will seek to go somewhere
Hmm.
to try and escape counterterrorism pressure.
Yeah,
So,
that
and I,
makes
and I,
sense.
I think sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa and the Sahel, and I probably would give more weight to the Sahel given the likelihood of cultural connections, from the Maghreb they could be more easily they can more easily fit in there. But again, that would this is down the road. I would also point to the development of training infrastructure. So as I recall, there was a satellite image of JNIM, and they have an estimated, I believe it's 20 either training or other camps
Mm,
in Mali that ISGS simply lacks. And so building up that training and indoctrination infrastructure would be another indicator of at least the ability, a greater ability to pose a worldwide threat, uh, if not to actually to do it. And then
yeah,
yeah,
I would just say, and I'm sure you were getting to this, but one of the biggest constraints, or what will especially temper their ability to do that, and really not so much their ability. I guess what I'm actually focusing on is that even in a part of the intent of these groups, which are, as we pointed out before in previous analysis, as you talked about in this conversation, are are incredibly localized in
mhm,
even just in their aspirations,
yeah,
in waging an active insurgency in Mali. that's necessarily going to constrain even their desire, their intent, even if it's coming from the core, to stage some kind of far enemy attack. I think that's one of the major things, aside, counterterrorism pressure aside, counterinsurgency efforts, things like that. It will also boil down to aspirations and a command and control structure that would even be able to facilitate or galvanize that kind of action.
Indeed, and I would also add the strength of these groups comes a lot from their localization. So their ability to relate to local communities, their ability to maintain an insurgency within their local communities is a strength, and the large influx of foreign fighters could potentially, it adds a strength insofar as it would add a tactical combat experience, but it may detract from their local appeal, or their ability to appeal locally. And so there is a question of, do they have the ability to integrate those foreigners the way that certainly the way that the Afghan jihad, the Arab Afghans kind of integrated more effectively in the Afghan jihad instance than I think. And then there are other issues than I think in the Sub-Saharan African context. And then there are also other issues of race and other other cultural issues that come into play as well. So
not to mention sheer geography. I mean,
not to mention
it's a
geography
difference
itself.
in making the trip to Afghanistan versus Ghana. So
true.
So with that, we're, of course, as is typical of Charlie and me, we're well over time. So we're going to go ahead and close out this conversation. But thank you so much, anyone and everyone who tuned in to this. Of course, as you can see in the blurb, you can learn more about RAIN's geopolitical intelligence analysis and solutions at rainnetwork.com. And please join us in the future as we continue to wrestle with these topics. Thank you very much.